Here's a question for you. If you could live 10 to 20 years longer, improve your memory, increase your creativity, look fitter, hold on a minute, get protection from diabetes to dementia to the common cold, feel happier, less anxious, less depressed, be more successful in your job and more emotionally intelligent, and you can have all of those things by just getting 1 extra hour of sleep a night, would you do it? Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker is a startling eye-opener at the world of sleep. See what I did there? More often than not, books tend to lend themselves to a certain audience, but in theory, this book is for everyone. How much do you know about sleep? Given it makes up 1/3 of our entire lives, if you're anything like me, it's probably surprisingly little. But in the famous words of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, don't panic. You're about to get a condensed lesson in Sleep 101. There are 2 main biological factors that are influencing you and I right now. The first one is the circadian rhythm, or our internal body clock, and the second is the sleep triggering chemical melatonin. The former really is our own internal body clock. If you were to go live in a cave devoid of light for the next month, you'd find that your body would move into this natural cycle of being awake for 15 hours and asleep for 9 hours. Now, it's no surprise that gets us to 24 hours because this process evolved with the day and night cycle of the sun. The latter is known as the hormone of darkness, and it's because of the fact that it regulates the timing of sleep and is triggered by light. Well, actually, lack thereof it. This is why we experience jet lag and why it's harder for our bodies to go east towards the sunrise. We want to sleep and our bodies feel really tired, but the low levels of melatonin are telling our body, hey, I know that you want to go to sleep, but I'm pretty sure that it's light outside, so don't worry about it. Instead, if we fly west towards the sunset, while we may lose some sleep, we're minimizing the disruption to melatonin, and it's the equivalent of just going to bed later. So we know what governs sleep, but what actually is sleep? Simply put, it's a cycle between 2 different kinds of sleep, and they're almost in a tug of war with each other, changing roughly every 90 minutes. And they get their names because of the observations of our eyes when we're asleep. Non-rapid eye movement is all about cataloging information, figuring out what is and isn't useful to store in the long term. And then there's rapid eye movement, this really isn't that fast, which commits useful memories, deals with emotions, and then also ties current events with previous ones through the neural network. The latter is heavily weighted towards the last hours of sleep, so if there's anything that causes a disruption to that, it could have some serious negative effects. To date, every single animal and insect studied engages in some form of sleep, or at least something remarkably like it. But REM sleep seems to come later in the evolutionary timeline, with mammals and birds being the only species so far where we've observed it. Humans, irrespective of culture or geography, seem to operate best with 7 to 8 hours of sleep. But more surprisingly, there's also a 30 to 60 minute nap thrown in there in the early afternoon as well. In fact, the afternoon nap is so fundamental that when Greece looked to take away the practice of siestas in the early 2000s, after a 6-year study was conducted by Harvard, they found that the negative health effects were so fundamental and unequivocal that it preserved in nature. When we start to look at sleep over our lifetime, it takes a child about 5 to 6 years to fully develop their circadian rhythm, which goes to explain their completely unpredictable sporadic sleep cycle in the early years, and why every single parent I've ever met with a newborn basically gets no sleep. Teenagers, on the other hand, interestingly enough, shift their circadian rhythm to be later than their parents. Now, that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because when we were dwelling in caves, the idea that they would stay up later past their parents' bedtime meant that they could socialize with their peer group. It would force independence and allow them to explore things within a safe environment before they flew the nest. And it also explains why teenagers have such a hard time getting out of bed in the morning. So parents, cut them some slack. Their circadian rhythm's just later than yours. Every single year, billions of us take part in the largest unauthorized experiment to do with sleep in the world. Can you guess what it is? Daylight savings. Every single year we go through the process of losing 1 hour of sleep, and like clockwork, the amount of heart attacks jumps right up alongside the number of car crashes. And we see the exact same thing happen when we gain an hour of sleep, except in the other direction. Less car crashes and less heart attacks. The proof really is in the pudding here, and there are so many real world examples that we can choose from that Matthew talks about in the book. If we have a look at the aviation industry, years ago they realized that 2/3 of their catastrophic crashes were happening within the last part of the flight, and they realized that a large portion of that was down to sleep deprivation. So of course the solution was pretty simple. Make sure that the pilot has had a nap between 40 and 120 minutes before they land the plane. But of course, if we're going to put this into the manuals and the handbooks, and we know it's going to find its way into the media, we got to think about something that we can call it that's going to sound pretty cool. So of course they ended up landing on a term that we all know and we all love, the power nap. And we can start to imagine the impact that this could have on education. And Matthew Walker, as the author, whenever he starts a seminar, does a little experiment where he asks the class how many people like to pull an all-nighter as part of studying. Next comes the shocking bit, and that's that if you pull an all-nighter and you don't get any sleep, you lose somewhere in the region of 40% of that learned knowledge. That's the difference between acing an exam and completely failing. Well, what about the subject of food? Well, when you get less sleep, your body inevitably uses more energy, and therefore it releases more chemicals into the body, telling you to eat more. Now, on the surface, that might not sound so bad. You might be thinking, well, they kind of even each other out. But unfortunately, they don't. And throughout the course of a year, this could add up to an additional 10 to 15 pounds of weight if you're not getting the right amount of sleep. REM sleep is absolutely fascinating, and the reality is, while we do understand a lot of it, we're still scratching the surface in a lot of places. One of the most interesting things to me is the idea that the emotional parts of our brain are 30% more active when we're sleeping in REM than when we're awake, and that largely explains why sometimes you can wake up feeling emotionally overwhelmed after a good night's sleep. For instance, you might have jumped to the conclusion, like I would, that our dreams were a retelling of the day's events, but actually that's known as day residue and makes up only 1 to 2% of sleeping, whereas emotional themes make up nearly 50% of what we dream about. In a famous experiment, when people were tasked with navigating a maze which contained different unique objects, those people that were able to nap before a second attempt and interact in some level with REM sleep were faster at navigating the maze than those that didn't. While that might not surprise you, the bit that will is those individuals who were able to nap before a second attempt and had REM sleep that focused on those individual objects or the theme around the maze were 10 times faster at navigating it. The dream world was taking fragments of the maze or the maze itself and tying it in with previous experiences. Think of it like a football manager watching the game tape and taking his knowledge of what happened and with the team and making changes. That's what our brains are doing automatically when we go to sleep. But what's even more fascinating is the fact that our neurons tend to fire at 1/2 to 1/4 speed. And that deceleration of neural firing might be the reason that we experience our dreams in a slower passage of time than the real world. REM sleep is the only period in the 24-hour cycle where you don't have anxiety triggering molecules released into your system. People with emotional trauma who regularly dreamt about the experience or the emotional themes behind it after 1 year show no signs of distress whatsoever versus those individuals who didn't. REM assisted dreaming results in 2 different things happening. Number 1, it allows us to take the useful information from the day and merge it with previous experiences. And 2, it allows us to decouple the emotional side of what's happening from the valuable, rich information. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense Because if every time we relived a memory, we had to relive the emotional trauma, whether that be positive or negative, well, it wouldn't be very useful or efficient. So as a result, being able to decouple those things allows us to maintain that information-rich experience without having to worry about the emotional side. So I guess that settles it. It's not time that heals all. Instead, it's REM-assisted dreaming focused on emotional themes that heals all. But I guess that doesn't have the same ring to it. For the last 100 years, we've been in a little bit of a tug of war with this constant strive for an improvement in our standard of living and in efficiency and the use of technology to enable that versus the way that our bodies work. And they've largely taken a back seat in relation to those things. Let's take the idea of light. Lights have unequivocally improved our lives for the better. But the thing you might not know is that even the weakest bedside lamp is causing a 50% reduction in your melatonin levels. So when you're getting into bed and going to sleep between, say, 10 and 12 p.m, your body clock thinks that it's probably around 7 to 8 p.m. because of the melatonin suppression. Then we've got blue LED lights, which you can find in a number of devices like iPads and phones. And while they're more efficient, the blue light is twice as damaging to melatonin than the warmer yellow lights that you get at home. Yes, there is now a mode on most of these devices that shifts the color of the screen in line with that warmer light. But for 90% of us, we use these devices at least an hour before bed, and it is still causing that significant disruption to our sleep cycle. So where possible, make sure you put those devices away before you go to bed and listen to an audiobook with the lights turned way down, or maybe all the way off. Well, what about temperature? Wait, what? What's temperature got to do with it, I hear you say? Well, our core body temperature needs to drop about 1 degree Celsius, and that's in line with the sun going down. But for a lot of us, we artificially heat or cool our homes. As a result, that confuses our body. The reason that you can find the bedtime ritual of splashing cold water on your face across different cultures is because it exposes the most vascular parts of your body, such as your wrists, your neck, and your face. You can also take a hot bath 1 to 2 hours before you go to bed, and while you might be thinking to yourself, hold on, that sounds counterintuitive, the idea is pretty simple. It helps to cool your body by water evaporating off your skin and taking the heat with it. Well, what about alcohol? Apart from the fact that it's been identified as one of the most powerful suppressors of REM sleep that there is, it can be pretty disruptive to sleep. Not only that, if you take alcohol on the night that you learn new information, you lose 40% of it the next day. And what's worse is that effect can last for about 3 days. Well, what about sleeping pills? Well, according to Matthew Walker, there isn't a single drug, illegal or legal, that exists today or has in the past that induces natural sleep. So how do we measure up to our counterparts from 100 years ago? Well, it turns out they've got a massive advantage because they slept on average 2 hours longer than we did today. And there's a long list of negatives for us as individuals in terms of how it impacts our career path. And I'm going to get the list out just because there's so many of them. It's been proven scientifically that losing those 1 to 2 hours of sleep results in a loss of productivity, lost creativity. We become lazier, we become more unethical, we become less happy, we're more prone to emotional outbursts. And when we're sleep deprived, we're more likely to lie, to blame others for our lack of work, or take credit for things that aren't ours. What's more, we don't even know when we're sleep deprived, and if we tend to get asked by somebody, do we think we get enough sleep? For most of us, we say the answer is yes. So there's a lot of ups and downs when it comes to sleep. But Matthew Walker talks about these 10 simple tips that you can integrate into your life to improve your sleep cycle and get a more efficient night's sleep. Number 1, no caffeine after 3 p.m. and minimize the amount of alcohol that you take. Number 2, establish a regular wake and sleep time, even on the weekends. Number 3, nap for 30 to 60 minutes in the early afternoon, never past 3 o'clock. Number 4, try and have a warm shower or a bath at least 1 to 2 hours before you go to bed. Number 5, no LED lights an hour before bed, please. Thank God they hit the sofa. Number 6, reduce natural light as much as possible in the hour before you go to sleep. Number 7, if you can't fall asleep when you're in bed, don't worry about it. Get up, do something boring, wait until you feel tired and go back to sleep. Number 8, reduce your anxiety, reducing thoughts before you go to bed. A little bit of meditation goes a long way. Number 9, remove clocks from your bedroom. You don't want clock watching paranoia. Number 10, if you can, use some form of sleep tracking app so you can see how things are going, and also make sure that there's a light alarm tone instead of the beep, beep, beep that you usually get in the morning. Matthew concludes that human beings have abandoned their biologically mandated need for adequate sleep, one that evolution spent 3.4 million years perfecting in service of life support functions. I believe it is time for us to reclaim our right to a full night's sleep without embarrassment or the damaging stigma of laziness. In doing so, we can be reunited with the most powerful elixir of wellness and vitality, dispensed through every conceivable biological pathway. Then we may remember what it feels like to be truly awake during the day, infused with the very deepest plenitude of being. Now, if that isn't poetic, I don't know what is. Thank you very much for watching. This was Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, and I'll see you in the next one.